360 Communities delivers safety and stability that improves lives. We've been doing this for over 50 years, one relationship at a time. Our free programs prevent homelessness, address hunger, boost high school graduation rates, and foster healthy relationships. We are the only provider in Dakota County offering safe shelter and services for victims of domestic and sexual violence. Get help or give help today and make a meaningful difference for yourself and your community. 360 Communities. Help in the moment, hope for the future.
Well, welcome. This is new. Everybody was actually seated. Normally I have to corral and argue and get people to get seated, so this is great. I'm Jeff Mortensen. I'm the president and CEO at 360 Communities. And on behalf of this incredible organization, welcome to the 39th Annual Domestic and Sexual Violence Awareness Luncheon. From its humble beginnings, some of you will remember this, but don't date yourself, when a few people had the courage to get together and discuss these difficult topics over a brown bag lunch, to this incredibly full room of people here to support this really difficult issue and to get educated, to learn how to respond better, and to support the work. Thank you for showing up, for being here today, and for engaging in the community. It is significant, so thank you for that. Domestic and sexual violence remain pervasive issues in our state and in our local communities. In Dakota County alone, more than 5 incidents are reported daily. 300 people gain immediate shelter and safety at our Lewis House emergency shelter. At least half of those residents are children. And on an annual basis, there's at least 500 people seeking shelter. Domestic violence is a leading cause of homelessness among women. Additionally, as an organization in this part of our program area, we help over 2,000 people on an outreach basis who are dealing with domestic and sexual violence that don't necessarily need a shelter, but they still need safety planning and resources. This is an issue that deserves attention by all of us, so thank you for being here. After lunch, we've got a great panel. I want to give a shout out to Ann Averill, who's really taken a big lead in helping to champion this. She leads our violence prevention and intervention area, but we've got a panel, and they're going to be talking specifically about coercive control. And coercive control is the invisible chain that binds a victim to their abuser. It is a subtle and very powerful form of abuse that strips an individual's autonomy and self-worth. So you're going to hear from a number of different perspectives in that space and learn and get educated about coercive control. But first, I want you to join me in thanking the sponsors and supporters that make today a success. We have a presenting sponsor, Sterling State Bank, who's been a presenting sponsor for many years, and we've got a good cohort here from them, so thank you. We've got our gold sponsor, the Lakeville Public Safety Foundation. And we have 2 silver sponsors, Squeaky Services and 2 Men and a Truck. So thank you, sponsors. I also want to thank Brackett's Crossing. Their staff and the leadership here always do an incredible job with these types of full rooms. So thank you, Brackett's Crossing. And thank you also to Flora, etc. They provided the centerpieces. Peggy Flanagan is Minnesota's 50th Lieutenant Governor and a member of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe. She is the highest-ranking Native American woman elected to executive office in the U.S. Her work centers on advancing equity for children, working families, communities of color, indigenous communities, and historically underserved Minnesotans. She co-chairs the Young Women's Initiative, prioritizes the state's homelessness response as chair of the Minnesota Interagency Council on Homelessness, and has helped secure key legislative wins, including creating the nation's first missing and murdered Indigenous relatives office,
expanding support for families, and investing in affordable housing, childcare, and community projects led by and for people of color. Thank you for being here. I welcome you up to the stage.
Well, good morning. Buju, Peggy Flanagan, and Dishnakaz, Gijuewa Damakoy, and Go, Guabaga, Ganikagnan Dunchaba, Mangandode. My name is Peggy Flanagan. My Ojibwe name is Speaks in a Loud and Clear Voice Woman. I'm a member, yeah, you can laugh, it's all right. My husband was the least surprised to know. I'm a member of White Earth. My family's the Wolf Clan, and the role of our clan is to ensure that we're not leaving anyone behind, which is why I feel like I am very good company this morning. Thank you, Jeff, and to 360 Communities, and for all of you who are here today. Survivors, advocates, community members, change makers, to reflect and to remember, and to recommit ourselves to ending domestic and sexual violence, especially as April is recognized as Sexual Assault Awareness Month. As we mark the 39th year of this vital event, I'm reminded that real change doesn't come from moments alone. It comes from movements. And this room represents a powerful one, a movement that is rooted in truth, in resilience, and the belief that everyone deserves to live free from fear and free from harm. We know that domestic and sexual violence are not just personal tragedies. They are systemic issues that touch every corner of our state, disproportionately affecting Indigenous women, women of color, members of the LGBTQ+ community, and those living at the intersections of multiple oppressions. We also know that violence doesn't always look the way we think it does. In Minnesota and across the country, advocates are lifting up the urgent need to recognize and respond to coercive control. The invisible chains of manipulation, fear, and domination that can bind a survivor long before or after physical violence occurs. Coercive control can look like a partner isolating someone from family, community, monitoring their movements, controlling their finances, or threatening to take away their children. It is insidious, it is dangerous, and it is too often dismissed because it can be subtle or perhaps lack visible signs of physical abuse. But survivors know, and advocates know, that coercive control can be just as life-altering, just as devastating, and just as lethal. That's why we must expand our understanding of what safety really means. It means recognizing power and control in all of its forms. It means believing survivors when they tell their stories. It means funding culturally specific services, investing in prevention, and working across systems to respond with compassion and not judgment. And it means updating our laws and policies to ensure that coercive control is not ignored, but named, addressed, and stopped. This is personal for so many of us. It is personal for me. I am a survivor, and I'm a child witness. Coercive control was often used in our home. I remember my mom saying to me, "I'm sorry I couldn't hang in there until you graduated from college." These are the kind of conversations, these are the kind of internal battles that people are facing oftentimes alone and in silence every single day. And I know that for my mom, she was embarrassed. She felt shame. And for a long time, I internalized that too. But what is clear to me is that in this moment, making myself or making ourselves as small as possible doesn't serve anyone. And so that is why I am so grateful that you are in this space. And to the courageous panelists who are ready to come up here and to tell your story, thank you. It matters tremendously because we think that this kind of violence and control somehow stays behind closed doors. It does not. It spills out into our neighborhoods, into our communities overall. And so gathering today, recommitting ourselves across jurisdictions, across party lines, across lived experience, is one of the most powerful things that we can do in this moment so people know that they are not alone. Together, we are building a Minnesota where survivors are heard, supported, and protected, not just in times of crisis, but every single day. Thank you for continuing to lead the way. Let's keep going. Let's keep showing up for each other, for survivors, for our children, for a future free from violence. Thank you.
All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our event and thank you all for being here. As Jeff said, my name is Ann Averill. I'm the Violence Prevention and Intervention Program Manager here at 360 Communities. And we're here today to talk about domestic violence and sexual violence. And these issues can happen in unique ways. One thing that we find to be consistent is the presence of coercive control. That's something we've kind of already brought up and talked about so far. But coercive control is a pattern of abusive behavior that intimidates, humiliates, isolates, and creates fear in victim survivors. Different studies have shown that between 65 and 95% of victim survivors experience coercive control. And as complicated as domestic violence is on its own, it becomes far more complex when children are involved, as an estimated 30 to 60% of people who use abuse also abuse children in the home or use children as an abuse mechanism, which can leave long-lasting impacts and effects on kids. I'm sure that many of you have seen or heard of the Power and Control Wheel. This is a tool that was developed right here in Minnesota in Duluth quite a long time ago, but outlines the different forms of coercive control and tactics that abusers use to gain or maintain power and control in an abusive relationship. The tactics that you can see on the wheel are intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying, and blaming, using children, using privilege, economic abuse, and threats and coercion. And then you can see on the outer ring of the wheel, physical violence and sexual violence. These tactics can happen independently. They often happen simultaneously. So victim survivors might experience one or all of the things that you see on the wheel, and happen over a period of time, which is what is known as the cycle of abuse. And what we know about this cycle is that over time, the time in between each phase of the cycle gets shorter and shorter because things seem to increase in frequency and intensity over time. And it's often paired with the threat of or the use of physical or sexual violence. Generally, these tactics are why people might stay in abusive relationships, why they might go back after leaving. And they also create misunderstandings among community members and sometimes professionals, and sometimes contribute to victim blaming in our communities. The tactics of coercive control and power and control are hard to see, they're hard to understand. And one survivor said in a powerful statement that the chains of abuse and power and control are invisible. And that's something we've already heard here today as well. I'm excited to introduce you to our panel of speakers. This is a complicated and complex issue, and so our hope is to just unpack this a little bit more. Each of our panelists today have experience and see coercive control and abuse show up in their work on a daily basis. And so excited to offer a variety of perspectives for all of you to learn about and think about as you're here with us today. So I will introduce the panelists and then we'll have them come up. Our first panelist is Hector Matas Castillo. Hector is the Executive Director at ASC Psychological Services. He is currently a doctoral candidate in clinical psychology with a specialty in forensic psychology. He is the mental health consultant and crisis negotiator for the Minneapolis Police Department SWAT Crisis Negotiation Team. As a multilingual, multicultural therapist, Hector works with domestic abuse from the micro and macro level. Our next panelist is Dr. Shannon Gecki Watson. Shannon owns SGW Psychological Services, which is an independent private practice right here in Dakota County. She focuses on treating the after effects of domestic violence, and she is a psychologist and a professional trainer for mental health professionals, lawyers, and domestic violence shelter advocates. And also, prior to entering the mental health field, Shannon worked as an advocate at Lewis House. So welcome. Our next panelist is Brittany Puckett. Brittany is the senior staff nurse with the Hennepin Assault Response Team, or HART, at Hennepin Healthcare. Since 2015, she has seen over 550 patients, and she is a certified sexual assault nurse examiner for both pediatrics and adolescents and adults. As a forensic nurse, Brittany provides acute exams for sexual assault, interpersonal violence, sexual exploitation, and trafficking victim survivors. And our last panelist is Jess Pallian. Jess is the policy program manager at Violence Free Minnesota. He works as a legislative advocate for the coalition, helping to communicate the needs of survivors and advocates to the legislature, and communicate legislative updates to the coalition. Jess holds a bachelor's degree in biology and a law degree both from the University of St. Thomas. He has experience as a housing attorney for Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid and as a court clerk in Hennepin County. So please welcome our panelists. I will ask them to come up now. All right, thank you all for being here. Just for all of you to know, we have kind of a Q&A style panel. So we have a set list of questions that I will ask the panelists and hopefully, again, shed light and dig into coercive control. The questions that we prepared are questions that are relevant to the work that they do, questions that we hear in advocacy often about this topic, and I think just kind of general things that sometimes come up when we are trying to understand about domestic abuse or coercive control. So our first question is for Hector. Hector, what do you see as the root causes of controlling behavior, and are there any predictors?
So there are root causes. When you start looking at why people would use these behaviors, one of the biggest ones is personality that's insecure. They don't feel like they belong many places, or they don't feel like they have a lot of control. Eventually it starts to develop into kind of an anxiety, right? You have to control everything around you. Where's a saber-toothed tiger? Everything's a saber-toothed tiger. And then it can progress into behaviors that are more, the word would be Machiavellian, right? The Dark Triad, if you've ever read the personality portrait of that. And then it becomes a little bit more insidious, right? This is a person who, out of a fear of losing control over whoever it is or whatever it is that they are trying to control, will start to do things that make it look like, nah, I'm not controlling, I'm caring, I'm loving, I'm looking out for you. These are areas that you don't know anything about. And then other forms of control can pop in. Like the one that's the most commonly uses gaslighting, right? But that's only one of many different behaviors. And so there are predictors. An individual who has either been a witness or themselves experienced domestic violence in their home as a child, and then that person grows up and either repeats the behaviors or looks for people that they can control. You find a lot of people who are codependent, In Codependence Anonymous, for example, they call it a codependent reactive moment when somebody starts trying to control whoever the subject is, or object in a way. Some of the biggest predictors according to research are in relationships where they're married in heterosexual marriage, the wife has 2 or 3 children, husband higher levels of degrees, and then the use of alcohol and increasing alcohol consumption, as well as a lot of other even higher predictors such as personality disorders. What you have to understand is that even though there may be mental health disorders, they're not the reason for it. This is a behavior that is chosen by the person who's using it. But we do see that these behaviors are often paired up with personality disorders, the biggest of which is obsessive compulsive personality disorder, amongst others.
Great, thank you. I like what you said about kind of what is not the cause, because I think sometimes we've seen that mental health is kind of viewed as the cause of domestic abuse.
Yeah,
Common,
almost, yeah.
almost common.
Our next question is for Shannon. How does coercive control affect mental health, specifically in victim survivors?
Great question. Oh, there we go. Great question. I actually want to start with a quote from Judith Herman. This comes from her book, Truth and Repair. Most people are familiar with her book, Trauma and Recovery, and she has a secondary book out now called Truth and Repair. If you haven't checked it out, I highly urge you. The first third of the book actually is on coercive control. On page 28, she says, violence does not need to be used often. It merely needs to be convincing when it is used. And I think that's a really important thing in light of everything that we're talking about here. In fact, she goes on to quote a CIA manual for the interrogation of detainees that specifically states, the threat of coercion usually weakens or destroys resistance more effectively than the coercion itself. And that's why we're up here and why we're talking about coercive control today, because that is what is true. The threat often is more effective than the actual coercion itself. So that threat has consequences. There are so many mental health consequences that come from it. One of those comes in the form of emotional consequences. A big emotional consequence that we see is shame. Shame as an emotion is actually really, really healthy for us to experience. The reason we have shame, the reason shame developed and evolved in us is because it helps us to grow and develop. Well, when it stops growing and developing for us, then we get into what we call toxic shame. Toxic shame is where we're stuck. It's like we're stuck in quicksand. We can't move forward. Coercive control contributes to that quicksand. It's that toxic shame, and that is very much a real consequence of coercive control. Another emotional consequence that we see is fear. Fear very much comes from coercive control. I have worked with many, many survivors who tell me that they will see their partner give them a look from across the room. And that look to them means a lot more because it's a threat. Going back to the power and control wheel, Anne, that you had up there, the power and control wheel states those threats are very, very effective. So getting that look from across the room that nobody else would know what that means, that survivor absolutely knows what that means, and it's known to keep that person in line. That fear is a very, very, very effective tactic. Other things I would add, anger. Anger is absolutely an emotional consequence. Now, sometimes the anger comes out explosively. We actually see anger is a symptom, explosive anger is a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, which can be a consequence of experiencing domestic and sexual violence. But for some folks, it becomes the opposite, where the anger becomes so internalized that they can't experience it. There's so much fear in experiencing it that people can't experience it, they can't connect to it, which is also really, really a harmful consequence. And then we get into specific mental health diagnoses. We see things like post-traumatic stress disorder, we see depression, we see anxiety. These are all more mental health after effects that come from experiencing coercive control. Then we get into the neurological after effects. I'm a massive brain nerd. I love to talk brain. If I had the time, I'd give you all a good brain talk today. Anne knows that. She's heard it. A lot of you have if you've gotten to the opportunity to do any of the volunteer classes. But there are really real consequences neurologically. We have what's known as a parasympathetic and a sympathetic nervous system. Our sympathetic nervous system's job is to keep us alive. It activates, it gets us ready to fight, flight, freeze, faint. We have the opposite system, which is our parasympathetic, which is what brings everything back to resting. Coercive control activates that sympathetic nervous system. It gets us ready to fight, flight, freeze, and faint, even if there's not actually a threat. And so coercive control plays into that and can absolutely just do haywire things to that sympathetic nervous system and make it really hard for that parasympathetic nervous system to re-engage. Our sympathetic nervous system engages instantly to keep us alive, and our parasympathetic can take days, weeks, often, to kick in and be able to bring us back to a relaxation state. So again, oftentimes a survivor is reactivated into a fight-flight state before they are even ready to be able to calm back down. Other after effects we see are hits to things like trust. I often get asked what's one of the biggest after effects of domestic violence, and my number one answer is hits to self-trust. So that's a big one. We see hits to trust in others, and a big part of what I do is teach people trust is on the spectrum. Self-esteem hits are a really big mental health after effect that we see. Hits to intimacy, hits to being able to understand power and control, not necessarily in the context of the wheel, but being able to understand our own autonomy and our power and control. So there's a lot of mental health after effects. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is for Brittany. Brittany, what are some of the tactics that you have seen or heard in the context of sexual assault?
Yeah, I'm glad that you had the power and control wheel pulled up in the beginning, because that I'm probably going to reference a couple times. But when it comes to sexual assaults, the most common form that we are going to see is that verbal control or that verbal manipulation. We can see it in ways that come to put guilt, to put shame on the victim survivor. We can see it as emotional, and this can come and go. It's a continuum, or it could be multiple things all happening at once. The purpose of it is so that their self-worth is undermined to the point where they're less likely to resist the abuse, or even after so long, they might not even recognize it as abuse anymore. So what we want to do is be open to those, understand how all that can impact a person, whether it's physical violence, whether it's sexual violence, or whether it's in the form of verbal. Another aspect we see when it comes to sexual assaults is the use of alcohol or substances being used. That can also show up in many forms. That can show up as a person willingly wanting to drink alcohol, use substances. It can show up as someone being forced to use that alcohol or substances. Or it can be someone feeling pressured to use that. And the goal of that is that when they are under the influence of that, their decision making or even their level of consciousness is inhibited, which obviously can impact how an assault could occur to someone. When these tactics are being used during a sexual assault, the goal is that they will engage in this sexual activity because they don't feel they have any other option instead of doing that. When that does happen over time, this creates a big power dynamic, which then makes that victim survivor feel trapped in that relationship and fearful of what could happen if they do ever not want to participate or refuse any of those sexual demands.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is for Jess. Jess, how do you see coercive control influence the system response or the community response to victim survivors?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I take a in my role, I take kind of a statewide view, and I'm oftentimes working with legislators, but also with the people who have to implement the laws. And one of the big issues with coercive control is that it disrupts the victim survivor's ability to even kind of communicate what's happening to them to the system actors that might be able to help. So if what's happening to you is subtle and it's not something that the person who's trying to help you is predisposed to recognize, if someone's used to looking at black eyes and what they're now seeing is somebody being insidiously controlled via verbal commands or threats, they might not have the same level of response that they probably should. So I think that's one of the big things, is it makes it harder for someone to advocate what's actually happening for themselves, because it's not universally accepted as a form of abuse. It is universally accepted by people here in our domestic violence abuse prevention movement, but it's not every person you see on the street will immediately recognize that as a form of abuse. And so that it makes it hard. And in fact, not every victim survivor will recognize that what's happening to them is a form of abuse. Sometimes you'll hear people say, it took me a year or two to realize that was kind of messed up, what was going on. And so that's one of the biggest things that impacts our community responses is that level of self-advocacy that every victim survivor in every abusive situation has to do gets harder when it's hard to have that exact language to describe what's happening to me and have this reasonable expectation that the person you're talking to will kind of intuitively understand that.
Thank you. One thing I'll add to that just kind of made me think of was one of the assessments that we use in advocacy is the danger assessment created by Dr. Jacqueline Campbell. And some of the questions on there, the questions are written in a way that are understandable and language that victim survivors use. So it might not be like what we would call strangulation. They might call choking as just an example. And so I think how people are able to share their story and the language that people are using is definitely kind of impacted by all that's happened. Our next question, back to Hector. Hector, what do you see or what have you heard as kind of justifications for controlling behaviors, or why people say they use abuse or control?
Sure, yeah. A lot of the people that we work with, right, they tend to say things along the lines of like, well, I'm helping them. They don't know what they're doing wrong. Or they pejoratively talk about the mental health disorders. Well, you have the borderline, right? It's not borderline personality, it's the borderline. So she's got the borderline. She doesn't know what she's doing. She does this all over the place. She's very emotional, she keeps flirting, and she's giving our kids a bad example of what it means to be a mom or what it means to be a woman. And I'm just trying to keep her straight. Or I also hear a lot of really grandiose religious ideology to control people. Well, I'm the head of the woman, and it's like, oh, yeah, maybe you shouldn't be the head of the woman. But, and so you hear that it's more about like, I'm helping you. One of the cases that I had, as we were just talking, was when I was at the Domestic Abuse Project, I had an individual that this doesn't normally happen, but he wanted to sit right next to me as a facilitator. And I'm like, what is this? Usually the seats around me are very empty. But he wanted to sit right next to me, and I'm like, hi. And I started hearing about his case, and he was referred because he had, over the years, now like 5 years, convinced his wife that she needed medications, she needed to go to the hospital because she's feeling suicidal. You didn't hear what you just said? In front of the kids? Honey, why are we arguing about this? I'm trying to protect the kids and you need help. And after about the 5th or 6th time that she went to the hospital, it was a social worker that realized she's recognized these kids before, and she befriended, or sort of made themselves an acquaintance. And so she told the dad, why don't I take the kids, get them some ice cream, and you take care of your wife. And when taking the kids off to the side, she asked him, so what's going on? Why does mom keep coming here? Well, daddy's making her think that she's not a good mom. Daddy's making her think that she's better off. Daddy's making her think that her medications aren't working. Daddy's this, daddy's that. Daddy's trying to keep the family together. And daddy thinks that she's cheating. So they come up with all of these reasons to make the other person less than a functional human being. I have to take control. Sometimes, one of the hardest things to believe about this is that, now in the higher level cases, it's obvious they know what they're doing. But when you start seeing the trajectory from somebody who's starting off in their previous relationships, there's research on this, how it begins to grow. If it worked in one relationship a little bit to get what you want, or at least make you feel like you're not as insecure, then you'll do it again in the next relationship until there's an intervention. And oftentimes, these individuals that come in and they're still young, they're still in their relationships, well, I thought I was doing the right thing, I thought that I was trying to be a good man, I thought that I was trying to be a good husband, a good father, a good boyfriend. They didn't realize that what they were doing was destructive when they're younger. Now, as they get older, and they've gotten through the system, maybe they've gone through some charges and convictions, maybe they've gone through some anger management, they're beginning to realize that their job is to not get caught, right? So then that's where the denying, the minimalizing becomes more insidious. Honey, let's be honest, I was trying to take care of you. Your mental health symptoms were coming out, the kids were watching it, the neighbors heard about it, everybody heard you yelling at me, and I was just trying to keep the peace. And here we are at it again. I'm sticking with you. I love you. I'm going to help you. Right? So it's all about the control. The bottom line is it's about control, and you're not going to leave me because I control you.
Thank you. I think that's a good segue to our next question for Shannon. How does coercive control or some of these behaviors create behavioral barriers for victim survivors?
I want to start by talking about shame. Going back to the emotion I mentioned earlier, I talked about the difference between shame and toxic shame. Again, shame is something we're meant to feel. It's actually healthy for us to experience. It helps us grow, it helps us develop until we get to the point we're in that toxic shame. But shame is also an emotion that is connected with social activity and social connection. And so when we're talking about reaching out to get help, oftentimes help comes in the form of social connection, whether it be coming in for mental health services, whether it be going in to be able to go, like to meet with Brittany, to be able to get physical health services, whether it involves coming into the shelter, no matter what it involves, more often than not, going in for help involves relationships. Shame is often, when we're talking shame, I'm talking in this case toxic shame. The barrier here is feeling dirty, feeling disgusted, becomes a barrier to being able to go in to get help, right? If I believe in my heart that I deserved what I got, it's going to be really hard for me to want to reach out, be able to manage the relationship side, and be able to reach out and ask for help. Because again, when I'm in that place of toxic shame, I don't want to socially connect. And I think that's really, really important for us to be aware. Shame acts as a barrier. Another one is fear. A lot of individuals who experience coercive control experience fear, as I already had mentioned. When we're talking about getting help, I honestly start every email of every person who reaches out to me by saying, thank you for reaching out. It takes a lot of courage to do this. That is my start of every email for every person that reaches out, because at the end of the day, it's true. It takes a tremendous amount of courage to reach out to get help. And so for us to be able to recognize and to validate, to fight back on that fear is incredibly, incredibly important. A lot of those individuals think we're gonna think they're crazy. And that's real. Because they have been told so many times that they're crazy, whether it be by their partners, by family members, or even by themselves. They've been told they're crazy, right? So they're expecting us to say the same to them. And so we don't want to do that. We need to be a voice to fight back on that message. Another big barrier, again, is individuals' own self-talk. Again, when you hear something so many times, you start to believe it. I cannot tell you the things I've had clients tell me that they've experienced in their self-talk, things that they truly believe. And I have conversations with them. One way I fight back with my clients and say, and this is something I do say to my clients, I say, if I tell you enough times that the grass is pink, because you trust me, eventually you're going to believe the grass is pink. Does that actually make the grass pink? It doesn't, but you start to believe it, right? That's the power of this coercive control. And I think that that's really, really important. We have to fight back on that. Sorry, pulling back up my notes here. Black-white thinking is another barrier that we see. Black-white thinking is when I fall into the category of things are either this or this. Either I'm in the right and he's in the wrong, or he's in the right and I'm in the wrong, right? So we all, every single person in this room experiences black-white thinking about something. We all fall into this where we fall into these categories of it's either this or it's this. Well, when we're talking about coercive control, it often is about negative self-talk, right? So again, as we already mentioned, this negative self-talk is going to be a barrier. And then we also fall into emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning is where I feel an emotion, oftentimes like conviction or fear or shame. And because I feel an emotion, it convinces me the thought behind my emotion is true. This is one of the biggest after effects of experiencing any trauma, whether it be domestic violence, sexual violence, you name it. It doesn't even have to be an interpersonal violence. But we fall into this trap of emotional reasoning. Because I experience an emotion that comes with a thought, I convince myself that thought is true. So that emotional reasoning is a massive barrier to seeking out treatment. So I will tell myself I'm stupid. I feel a bit of conviction behind being stupid because I should have known better, right? So I will feel shame, I'll feel guilt and think I should have known better, which means that I'm not going to seek out help because of that. And then the last thing, and Brittany hit on this a moment ago, that we'll see is people will choose to turn to other forms of self-medication. We'll see things like substance abuse. People will turn to substance abuse. The overlap between eating disorders and trauma is well over 90%. People will turn to unhealthy coping strategies because they're looking for any way to manage. Because again, going to seek out help takes being in relationship, and that is really freaking hard. So, thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. Our next question is for Brittany. So Shannon definitely kind of talked about the mental health impacts of domestic violence or domestic abuse and coercive control. The question for Brittany is how does domestic violence or domestic abuse and coercive control impact a person's physical health, and how does it impact maybe the greater public health?
Yeah, so going back to that power and control wheel again, we're looking at all aspects of someone's life that can be manipulated. One of the biggest ways we see is support systems, whether they're moving them away from family, maybe making them feel guilty about wanting to go out for dinner with friends. They're slowly taking away those relationships that people have comfort in. Another way is monitoring their daily activities. That can be something like having cameras in the house so that they feel like they're being watched, that control is there. They're always feeling like someone's watching them, controlling what they're doing, even in their home. I know Hector talked a lot about gaslighting, making the person, that victim survivor, always feel like they're in the wrong and the abuser is always in the right. They're constantly putting them down. They're really eroding that person's individual autonomy. And then even going into controlling aspects of their health and body. I've seen it where people are on exercise regimens, where they're on a diet regimen. They're controlling even something that maybe brought that person joy at one point, and now it's another thing that's being controlled. They can deny them finances. So maybe at one point they made them quit their job. Maybe they're given an allowance every week that they can only use, or maybe they don't even have access to their finances. The goal of all of that is to not have, that person doesn't have any autonomy anymore, which makes it that much harder for them to be able to leave. Clearly, all of that can impact someone's physical health. And how that can impact our society and our public is social isolation, like you talked a lot about too. People don't want to go out when they have shame, guilt, fear on what the repercussions could be if that's something that they choose to do.
Can you also talk a little bit about reproductive coercion and how coercive control plays a role in that and how that shows up in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. And that can be done in multiple ways as well. That can be done as limiting access to birth control. That can be forcing someone to be on birth control. It can be forcing to terminate pregnancies. It can be forcing them to go through with the pregnancy. Thankfully, there are some ways that this can be helped with people. Birth control options that are available. There's IUD placements that can be completed. There's Depo shots that can be completed. Emergency contraception can be offered. But all of that, a lot of the time, is also time sensitive, which can be very difficult given the circumstances of the abuse that's going on. Not only is it the physical aspect that affects that with reproductive abuse, but it also is a huge mental effect. If a woman is going through a pregnancy where it's maybe something they didn't want, they're going to have a lot of resentment towards that pregnancy, and they might even have resentment towards that child, which then can really impact that mother-child bonding experience. And a lot of people then will look at their children and they're seeing that as a reminder of that abuse and that control that's ongoing in that relationship. Depression is a big thing that they could experience. And then in regards to the baby, low birth weight is a really big side effect that can happen just because of the possibility that it was a poor pregnancy, poor support, whatever it might be. And through all of that, the mother might feel like the best decision is to conceal all that information to make sure that the child-father relationship isn't harmed in any way, which is then putting another burden on her as well.
Thank you. So our next question is for Shannon, and I think this is something that we hear often in advocacy is, what should I do? What do I need? How can you help me? And so the question is, how can people break free from coercive control? What is needed in order for someone to heal?
That is a very complicated question. And the reality is there's a lot of different ways to break free, which is good. First off is going to be social support. The biggest protective factor against any mental health diagnosis that there is social support. And that includes everybody that is in this room. Earlier, Jeff asked us all to stand if we had experienced domestic violence or knew somebody who had. The reality is every single one of us in this room could have been standing because the prevalence rates of domestic violence and sexual violence are that high. I would be really hard pressed to believe there's not a person in this room who doesn't at least know somebody who's experienced it, which means that we all have the ability to make a difference in somebody's life and be able to connect with somebody and be able to provide social support to somebody. I regularly get phone calls from people, even people who aren't clients. I get family members that call me up and they say, what do I do? I have a family member who's experiencing DV or sexual violence. What do I do? And again, oftentimes these folks aren't clients or in any way connected to clients. And my answer to them always is just be there. Avoid that question. Please, please, please don't ask that question. Why don't you just leave? That question induces shame, and you've already heard me talk about shame twice, so I won't go down that pathway again right now. But that question induces so much shame. So instead of trying to push somebody to do what you really, really want them to do, be there. Be their social support. Be with them, walk with them, support them, ask them what they need. Don't be their rescuer, be their empowerer, right? So that is one really big important aspect of being able to break free, is that social support. Another aspect is for a survivor to be able to really work on managing their self-talk. There's a lot of good ways to be able to do that. Psychotherapy is one of them. There's a number of really good post-traumatic stress disorder structured protocols. I use 2 of them particularly. Being able to really fight back on that self-talk, so getting through that shame, getting through those shame-based statements, getting through that black-white thinking that I had previously mentioned, that emotional reasoning, being able to fight back, being able to get through the I should have known better, I should have seen the red flags, goodness, I could go all the way down. We also have to fight back on some of the overgeneralized beliefs. Not only do we have people's guilt about their own quote-unquote role in all of this, but then we have to fight back on the overgeneralized beliefs. Like in the context of domestic violence, one of the most common things that I fight back on with people is that all men are evil. Mm-hmm. No, not all men hurt women. In fact, the vast majority of men don't hurt women, and we have to go through that and talk that over. So a really big part of this is fighting back on that self-talk and being able to change that self-talk. Another big thing is being able to help people differentiate that there's a difference between submission and consent. Submission means that you are doing something without consent. Consent means you are doing it freely, right? And so when we are talking about things, this is Sexual Violence Awareness Month. This is a really big one that I've been talking a lot about with clients right now. If somebody is holding me at gunpoint and asks for my wallet and I give them my wallet, I am submitting to them to give them my wallet. I am not consenting to give them my wallet. I am submitting my wallet to them, right? I'm not consenting. The same is true in the context of sexual relationships. And that is true not just in sexual relationships, but bodily autonomy. And so a big part of working to overcome and heal from all of this is being able to understand there's big differences between submission and consent. And then I would also add, we have to do things like work through self-compassion, work through self-care, work through self-love. For some people, it involves breaking the silence, which a lot of people in this room are big contributors to. Thank you for everybody in here that's an advocate that's helped do things like write victim impact statements, that have helped people with memoirs, things like that. That's a really big part of breaking the silence. So that's also a big part of how we help people break free from all of this. Education. I'm a believer the best intervention in the world is prevention, right? So if we can keep talking about this, it's what we're all doing today, so thank you all for being here to be talking about this, because again, best intervention is prevention. So if we can prevent coercive control by educating people, I'm a believer in that too. So thank you, Anne, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. One thing that came to mind is something that I've shared in a variety of trainings when people kind of want to know, what can I do to help, or what should I say? And there are, Shannon talked about having a support system and being a support person for victim survivors. And the 3 things that I always leave people with is listen, validate, and believe. And you might be the first person that the survivor is sharing their story with, and how you respond. If you don't listen, if you don't validate, and you don't believe, that shapes the entire rest of their experience. They might not say anything again. So that's my 2 cents on that as well. The next question I have is for Hector, and I think this is also something that we see a lot in advocacy, is when the work that we're doing is, we hear a lot that within a relationship, victim survivors, what they want is they want the abuse to stop. They don't necessarily want to leave the relationship. They just want the abuse to stop, and they want to have a healthy relationship with the person that they're with. And so the question here is it possible for a person who uses abusive behavior, such as coercive control, to change? And if so, how do you work to address that?
Yes. Otherwise, my job would really suck, right? Hey, nobody ever changes. Thanks for coming. But yes, I completely agree that anybody is capable of change. And it starts with a choice. Realizing that what you're doing it isn't working. It's destructive. It's toxic to relationships, to yourself even. The amounts of cortisol that you dump into your body when you're an angry person, geez, you know, fatty liver is associated with that. Fatty liver is associated with fatigue, and then more aggressive levels of behavior. It's one bad cycle, right? So I do believe that people can change. And the way that we start that, oftentimes, especially with my most personality disorder people, is I'll clean it up because it's a family event, but it's stop doing stupid stuff, right? And the treatment plan for somebody who's antisocial or who's a sadist is stop doing stupid stuff because the rest of us are going to put you in jail or prison, right? So stop doing stupid stuff. So with the higher level of psychopathy, it's just a crisis negotiation, right? I'm gonna appeal to your ego and your sense of wanting to like just be left alone, do your own thing. Fine, you can do your own thing, just stop hurting people because we're gonna catch you, right? So that's higher levels. But then most of what we do is, like in my programs that I've started, it's looking at where did the trauma begin. One question that guys don't get asked often, and we've had some individuals that have done some heinous things. We're listening to like people who have really hurt people. I mean, I'm not going to get into some of the torture that we listen to, but just the question of where did you learn how to do that? Where was that modeled for you? How did you even know how to do that? And then it starts the cycle going like, oh my gosh, yeah, there was a genesis to this, and it wasn't a happy little story of being raised in a home where I got everything I wanted. There's a lot of aces back there, and so what we do is we look at cognitive behavioral models. I specifically use dialectical behavioral therapy to be able to get to the trauma that may exist. There are a few individuals where it's obvious that this is a high level of psychopathy. Those individuals don't get caught as much. We get the ones that get caught, right? And then sometimes the ones that are spouse referred because they don't want to get caught, and their wife or their spouse is saying it's time. We're leaving if you don't do something about this. We'd like to get them when the OFPs are in family court. We'd like to see them then, honestly, because they don't realize that you got an OFP because you're using this type of behavior. So we start with that, and then we start working towards treatment of whatever it is their own trauma and shame is, because when there is toxic shame, we know that they're probably going to do it again. Research has taught us, back in 2002, UK studies showed that when there's criticism, when there's hostility and overwhelming emotions, and you're dealing with your own mental health stuff, if you perceive it in any way, then you're more likely to get spun up in your basal ganglia and you're going to start acting out of your mental health disorder. But if you're able to deal with that, if you're able to realize this isn't about me or whatever it is that you need, maybe it is about me, but I don't have to internalize this, I don't have to control this, and you're able to let go of it, then it starts to create environments that are safe. We do see most of our clients that come through our programming do stop. We have some cool stories. It's actually one of the coolest programs that we run because you see the transition. Guys coming in and saying things like, hey, I just got out of jail, when'd you get out? To like, man, you're gonna want to stay in this program, it's gonna change your life. We were just listening to a guy this past Tuesday who was saying, man, I've only been using these skills because I wish I learned this when I was 12 years old. I wouldn't have gotten myself into these messes. I wouldn't have done the things I've done. I wouldn't have been so mad and felt like this is the only way to do things. Like, I wish I learned this when I was 12 years old. Man, when I was 12 years old, they taught me how to make a pillow, a skateboard pillow. That's done nothing for me today. So yeah, people do change, and when they do change, it's remarkable to see how much they want to make everything else change around them. Like, I gotta fix this, or I gotta let them go because I've done my damage. I have to move on with life, or whatever it is, but we do see people change. And it starts with stop doing stupid stuff. Simple treatment plan.
I just wanted to thank you for that answer, and also just highlight for anyone in the room who is hearing this thinking, oh, this is the type of programming that me or someone I know could use. Violence Free Minnesota, the coalition I work for, we maintain on our website a directory of Minnesota's domestic abuse transformation programming providers. So first off, if you are a provider and you're not on our website, let us know. And if you would like to find that kind of thing, you can just go to our website, vfmn.org, and find a provider near you.
Awesome. I didn't know that existed.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's great.
You can keep the mic, Jess. Our next question is for you. So how do you suggest people talk about domestic abuse, coercive control in general? I know there's been a lot of kind of suggestions for media outlets and different articles and authors to kind of call it what it is. And so I think the question is, how do you suggest we talk about it or write about it?
Yeah, thanks for that. And if you let me, I could take up the rest of our time here. So I'm gonna limit myself to 4 parts. So first, historically, the conversation where we started using this phrase coercive control, a lot of people think of that as like starting to kick up around the 90s and especially recently. This isn't a new concept, nor is it a new thing that's happening to people. Something I point out a lot to people is if you look back at the Seneca Falls Women's Convention, 1848, we oftentimes think of that as like the kickoff of the women's suffrage movement, but the Declaration of Grievances at that included things like freedom to divorce, fair shake at custody proceedings. A lot of these things that were expressing an imbalance in the power between men and women in relationships that needed to be corrected and warranted a state correction. So people were having this discussion way back then. And if we think about the ways that people control each other, whether in relationships, whether in working relationships, whether in government to person relationships, those methods of control started developing the second we started organizing as a society. So it's just important to note that when we talk about it, maybe the terminology developed recently, but there is a whole body of feminist, criminological, philosophical work that existed millennia ago already talking about these issues, and it's, I think, just important to recognize kind of our forebears in this and know that we're not new, we're not inventing something new, but we are talking about it in a way that maybe we've not talked about before. The second thing I want to talk about is how we talk about it directly. So when we talk about coercive control, I think it's important that we know that our kids can use that word, that they can say coercive control, that they know what it means, so that if it's happening to them, they can express that instead of just saying like, oh, my boyfriend is being a jerk. They might be able to use actual language, so you know this is a regular type of a boyfriend being a jerk, or it is something more than that, right? So making sure that they're able to talk about that directly and that you've talked with children directly, that you've talked with your friends directly. And then we talk about this a lot, all 4 of us have been doing it, as a lot of times, because of the way that society is structured and the power dynamics that we have, this is most commonly a situation where a man is the perpetrator and a woman is the victim. That is not always the case. We have cases of men being victims with women as perpetrators. LGBT relationships are certainly not immune to this. And so I think it's just really important to kind of wrap those in, know that you should be talking about this to your daughters and your sons, both from the perspective of them being a perpetrator or them being a victim, and knowing what they need to look for to make sure that they are contributing healthily to relationships. The next thing to talk about this is how we talk about it indirectly. Even when we're not talking about coercive control, how are we modeling healthy conflict resolution in relationships, both for children and for others? How are we making sure that we are regularly checking in with each other about our relationships? You know, you don't have to be like, oh, hey, I haven't seen you in a while. Are you being coercively controlled? But you can be like, hey, I haven't seen you in a while. How are things going? And listen for things in there and just make sure that they know, whoever that is, that they can talk to you about how their relationship is going and that you will be receptive to that. And you never have to say for them, hey, I think you're being abused. Hey, I think this is coercive control. But they do have to know that they can talk to you openly about whatever is happening in that relationship. So it is important to think about it as this sort of indirect communication as well. And then lastly, you mentioned specifically media. One thing that we do a lot at Violence Free Minnesota is try to make sure that our media is reporting on domestic violence responsibly. So when you're reporting on domestic violence, we always want to make sure that you are using words that are affirming to a victim, that are not blaming a victim, and that are expressing what actually happened without using too much euphemism. But importantly also, we want if someone to read that story and say, this sounds like what's happening to me, we want there to be right at the bottom that if you or someone you know needs domestic violence services, call, and then the number is usually the Day One hotline. That is our statewide hotline and a great resource. But sometimes it'll also be the Day One hotline plus, like, if it happened in Dakota County, they would say they might also give 360 Communities, or if it happened wherever it happened, they might tell you the local resource. If you can add those types of resources into articles about coercive control, about this thing that not everyone's always recognizing as domestic violence, or you're reporting on a relationship that might be toxic, but you are not able to publicly identify as a relationship abuse, there's still no harm in making sure everybody knows where they can find their resources. So from a media perspective, naming it honestly and making sure that whenever you might be touching on DV, you are giving DV resources, both of those things really help us as a society talk about this more directly. And I guess if I have to wrap it up in one sentence, people should be able to talk with clarity about what they're experiencing in their relationship. And part of that is on them to learn the words, and part of that is on you to listen through whatever words they're using.
Thank you. I have one more question for you, Jess, and this has come up when Lieutenant Governor Flanagan was speaking and talking about coercive control and the legislature and laws around coercive control. And we also know that there are laws in other countries about coercive control. Wondering, are there laws here in Minnesota that address coercive control? And what is your stance on that?
Yeah, so there are not right now laws that specifically name coercive control. There are ways that elements of coercive control can come into a court case. So for example, in a custody proceeding, one of the things that parents have to be talking about is their ability to cooperate together, and a lawyer might say, hey, look at this pattern of behavior, right? So there are ways that it can come in even if it's not explicitly named. But you're right that there's a variety of approaches to this issue in the law. And one thing I want to start off saying is everybody in our movement agrees that this is a form of domestic violence, that it requires confrontation. Not everybody agrees if the state and if the justice system is the right venue for confronting the issue. So where coercive control laws kind of kicked off was the UK, and they've been kind of spreading throughout the continent. In the UK, it is just in their definition of domestic violence for the purpose of crimes, family court, orders for protection. In the US, a few states have started to introduce it. Some of them specifically say coercive control. Others have a description of the behaviors that a domestic violence advocate would recognize as coercive control, but they might not use that word. But in general, in the United States, almost all of our states just have it in the order for protection statute or equivalent. So you're not going to get charged with a crime for it, but somebody could get a restraining order against an abusive partner for it. I know Hawaii has a pilot program as a crime, but it's a petty misdemeanor, which is like a parking ticket or a speeding ticket. There's not a police department in the world that's going to put a ton of resources into researching the specifics of a relationship dynamic to issue a parking ticket, right? That's just, I have talked to the coalition there, it's not being charged. I don't know of any other states that have any criminal consequences. In Minnesota, we have been hesitant to add it, and I'll just kind of explain a little bit why. With this being a more subtle form of abuse that's harder to explain, you're not explaining an event, right? A physical abuse event, something like somebody getting punched, somebody getting strangled. That's an event that can be proven and specifically happened in like a tangible period of time. But coercive control is a relationship dynamic. It's still abuse, but it's a more difficult thing to prove. And one of the fears that we have is that we already have a really hard time getting people their order for protection if they're experiencing physical violence. We already have a hard time getting people believed if they're experiencing physical violence. And we just don't know quite yet if we're ready to start addressing this other thing through the law. The other bit about it is we have some issues with specifically people of color being viewed as aggressors when they're not being aggressors. And so when we're talking about a relationship dynamic and you're trying to explain a relationship dynamic that might be coercive control, there's fear that abusers might control the narrative and might make specifically women of color look like aggressors when they're just doing regular relationship stuff to assert their needs. And that is the last bit, which is that most of our survivors going to court aren't represented by counsel. And so if you have two people unrepresented and one of them is abusing the other, they are going to have a big advantage in controlling the narrative that gets presented to the court. And so they're going to have a big advantage in saying, I mean, how often do we hear, I'm sure we all hear, Your Honor, she's driving me crazy. Your Honor, she made me do that. She's actually coercive controlling me. And as advocates, we would often be able to recognize that, but the court has a more limited scope, and when people don't have an attorney and they're used to being controlled, they're not always able to set their own narrative. So there's a lot of barriers here, but that doesn't mean that it's completely impossible for us to be addressing this as a society. I want to just stress to everyone in this room, whether you are seeing this happening in your own life, whether you are law enforcement, whether you're a systems actor, if you're seeing this happen and you don't think that you can bring a criminal charge, you don't think you can do something like that, you still have 360 communities here. You can refer to advocates who have the best practices on that. You still have the Day One hotline. You have this whole community-based network of people who know about this issue, who are ready to help clients deal with it, even if that's not necessarily through a typical state response.
Okay, thank you. So I feel like we could do this all day, but we do have to wrap it up. So one more question, same question for everyone on the panel. If there's one thing of all of the things that you would like people here to know and leave here with, what would it be?
Go ahead. You want to keep going?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is what I just said about making sure that you know that there is a whole network here. At Violence Free Minnesota, we're a coalition, so we're blessed to have 360 Community as a member. We also have over 90 other members from every corner of the state of Minnesota. It's a network of people ready to fight for you. It's a network of people ready to listen to you, believe you. And it's a network of people if you are here from the system, for you to refer to and rely on as partners in making sure that the people you see suffering from domestic and sexual violence can get the help, the community support that they need. So if there's one thing to take away from me, it's that every corner of the state has somebody there to listen to survivors, and you just gotta refer.
And I would say, for me, some of the most important things to take away would be to understand what the goal of that abuser is for those victim survivors. They want to take away independence. They want to make them feel scared and isolated, and that the tactics they use are a variety of ways. It's not just physical. It's not just sexual. It's not just mental control. It can be all aspects, and it can be a range of when they show up. These tactics that are used are targeted and tailored specifically to those victim survivors. And they are subtle and they escalate slowly over time. I've also found when I'm with my patients, kind of like Anne stated earlier, you don't always have to fill the space with your voice. Sometimes being a presence there and listening and encouraging them and knowing that you hear them and their story is sometimes the encouragement they need to continue to get help. So reach out to them, be a confidant for that person, let them know that you are there as a resource and a support in whatever aspect they might need. Don't make promises you can't keep. Don't force anything on them. It's really important to meet them where they are at in their journey of this, and that they know they can come to you at any point, maybe when they are ready to leave or when they are ready to get more support and resources.
I would say that coercive control is real and it has after effects, and those after effects are treatable. So I hope that you all take away with you today that those after effects are treatable. I have seen the research, I've seen the brain scans. There is no trauma out there that can't be treated. So I ask you all to please know and to please make sure that you refer for good treatments. Trauma is treatable.
I would say, since I already talked about that change is possible, you've already heard me say that, but the biggest thing is if you are one of those programs out there that do bad intervention programming, I think that I could say this with, well, let's just say, a certain sense of passion. We're not doing a good enough job. We need to do better. We can't have programs where guys just go, they show up, and because there's nothing else, then they get, a check mark. We're dealing with individuals who, if we don't intervene effectively with the most evidence-based and empirically supported treatments, programming, whatever you want to call it, then we're creating a problem. If you've done any kind of behaviorism, you know that intermittent reinforcers increase the problem behavior. And we have a lot of intermittent reinforcers out there. And I'm begging you, actually, as a bad intervention programming, if you've gotten, I'm just gonna say it, if you've gotten a little bit behind on your research, behind on your reading, behind on developing programming, behind on what's actually happening these days, you're not doing the people that you're serving a service. And I'll ask you and I'll challenge you as a colleague in the field to rise up to that level. Read the research, do your homework, get the training, right? And let's get people safe again.
Great. Thank you all so much for being here. I would also like to answer the question of what I would like people to leave here with. And I think for me, it's knowing that we need to stop asking why people don't just leave. And hopefully this conversation has helped equip you with all of the reasons or part of the reasons why people don't just leave, so we don't have to ask that question anymore. So thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate your time. I've spent time planning with our panelists and learned something new here today, even after spending all of this time. So thank you so very much, and let's all give them a round of applause.